Well, good morning. Well, it is morning where I am recording, when I'm recording this, I should say. We're going to continue on with our discussion of the broader topic of abnormal psychology for IB, but we're going to cover the second part of the Learning Outcome 5.1, which is 5.1b. The overall thing that we're talking about here are concepts of normality and abnormality. And we're going to have a quick little review here. First of all, we defined normal versus abnormal using a thin model here. And this particular model is being provided by Joda, a 1958 study in which the absence of mental illness is considered to be normal. The realistic self-perception and contact with reality is considered to be normal. Again, autonomy and independence and independence are considered to be a sign of normality, and the ability to maintain healthy interpersonal relationships, the capacity to love, for example, is considered a sign of normality, and the ability to cope with stressful situations and the capacity for personal growth and self-actualization is a sign, according to Joda 58, of defining normality. Now, this is a broad kind of a sweep, and Joda does provide us with a real good idea for a baseline. But a slightly different baseline for this would be the SAS study, and I've got these down on the next page here, so let's just move on to that. So we've talked about the Joda study of 58, the SAS study of 62. In this study, they looked at the psychological normality and abnormality are culturally defined concepts which are not based on objective criteria. So SAS is actually, I think, in my opinion, a pretty good one to respond to instead of looking for the particular criteria that Joda actually begins to talk about, what we talked about in our last lesson. And the third one here, and just a little bit broader, not as broad as Joda, and certainly a little bit broader than SAS, is Taylor and Brown's study of 88, a more recent study that argued that the view that a psychological healthy person is one that maintains close contact with reality is not in line with research findings. Generally, people have positive illusions about themselves, and they rate themselves more positively than others. Now, this one I don't expect a lot of you to remember because it can be a little vague. I like SAS because it's pretty easy to remember as far as what is normal and what is abnormal. Society dictates that, and we're going to see that as we finish up the rest of today's lesson. Going back to defining abnormality, we could just go back to SAS again, SAS 62. And the study argues that it is not possible to find biological correlates of mental illness. Okay, therefore, psychological disorders should rather be seen as problems of living. Now, is there a problem with SAS's study here in 62 that says that not possible to identify biological correlates of mental illness? And I would argue probably so. And as we go through this unit on abnormal psychology, I hope you're going to begin to see that biological functions have a role in abnormal psychology, such as cognitive functions, such as social cultural functions. They all three have their mark on abnormal psychology and normal psychology, if you will. Okay? The next thing I want to look at is not a review anymore, but in fact, new material. And that is to look at it's abnormality as a statistical deviation from the norm. And so we talked about early on in the year, we talked about statistics and how statistics can, or just about anything can be quantified. Okay, just like the hard sciences do, we can quantify what is considered to be normal and what is considered to be abnormal. Those behaviors that do not fall within a standard deviation, plus or minus, could be seen as abnormal behaviors. Socialization, the way they self-actualize, the way they perceive. If they don't fit the standard deviation, plus or minus, then we could say statistically that they are fitting in the scale of abnormal. But is it okay to use statistical measures? Well, I draw your attention to the following. The use of statistical frequency and deviation from statistical norm is not a reliable criterion to define abnormal behavior, since what is abnormal in a statistical sense may both be desirable and undesirable. So just look at it this way. Those that fit in the upper quadrants and lower quadrants of the standard deviation may not necessarily fit the overall desire of the norm, and therefore may be looked upon as being abnormal. Okay, the second bullet here is that what may be considered abnormal behavior can differ from one culture to another. Let's go back to SAS, I should say, and this kind of fits there too. It's impossible. Okay, let me read that again. So, what may be considered abnormal behavior can differ from one culture to another, so it is impossible to establish universal standards for statistical abnormality. And this is probably the heart of the problem with statistical deviations of norm. Okay, the model of statistical deviation from the norm always relates to a specific culture. So we could take our American statistical model and move it to Japan or China or Africa, certain cultures, certain groups in Africa, and say, does it fit the same norm? And probably not. Probably not. So let's go on. What I want to talk to you here is a publication that may or may not have been broached in normal conversation in the classroom, and that is the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is the American version. This is an American text. I think it's also used in Canada as well too. But the DSM, as it's commonly referred to, is currently in its fifth edition right now. But I'm drawing your attention up here to the view from the DSM 2, which was a 1968 publication, and the question of homosexuality. When we talk about defining abnormal or normal behaviors within a given society, then the classic example is referring to the DSM, which all mental health specialists, psychiatrists, psychologists, mental health care nurses, the whole gambit of the profession was using in 1968 this particular model, the DSM-2, published in 68, to define, for instance, homosexuality. In 1968, leading up to and including 1968, until the DSM, I think it was 3, 4, certainly 4, came out, homosexuality could be found in there as a deviation of social norms. So if in 1968, if you were seen as being, or you were a homosexual, if you were gay, then in 1968, you would have been labeled as mentally ill. Bottom line. So what I'm asking you in 2016 is, how is being seen as seen by mental health? How is it? I may have written it wrong, but how is homosexuality being viewed by the mental health community now? So you could take a look in the current issue of the DSM-5, for a clue, and you won't find a clue that says in there that homosexuality is a deviation of social norm, that is a mental illness. That's the bottom line here. I think it's been omitted since DSM 3 or 4. 4, I think certainly by 4, but it may have been lessened by 3, and I don't know the publication date of those. But what the bottom line here is that I'm trying to make a point with is that the DSM is the manual by which we look at how mental disorders are classified. Do you meet the criteria? And I would suggest, I really would suggest, even though you're not going to find an assessment on this, but you can find online versions, certainly of the DSM-4, free. and then which you can consult it, and it will tell you what criteria you need to display symptom-wise in order to fit that particular disorder. Okay, there's specifics or non-specifics. You meet 4 out of the 5 criteria, you're diagnosed this way. 3 out of the 5 criteria, you're diagnosed this way. If you have a preponderance of this, you might be diagnosed this way. There are a variety of different ways of looking at the DSM and how psychologists, psychiatrists actually so-called label, and I'm putting quotation marks around the word label, people with mental disorders. And it changes. I think I may have mentioned to you in class, for example, that Asperger's, which when the DSM-4 was in vogue, when it was published, and by the way, the DSM-5 came out about 2 years ago. Don't quote me, 2 years ago. So we were dealing with, when I began teaching this, the DSM-4, which simply said autism spectrum, okay, the whole gambit of autism spectrum included, to a lesser degree, the diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome. Okay, Asperger's syndrome. But when the DSM-5 came out, we moved the definition of Asperger's down to make it more narrow, not Asperger's, autism, to more clearly define what autism is and is not, which did not include Asperger's. So those people that had Asperger's were diagnosed with Asperger's now found themselves with the new publication of DSM-5 to be outside of that spectrum of autism. So you can look at it this way. If the Social Security Administration had defined autism spectrum as a disability for which you would qualify for disability payments, and Asperger was included under the DSM-4. Today, with the DSM-5, Asperger's is outside of that realm and may or may not qualify for disability payments as a direct disability. I don't and have not seen a current issue of DSM-5, so I really can't answer that question for you very specifically. But the DSM does play a role here in the United States in helping us decide what is a mental disorder and what is not a mental disorder. And to know what your mental disorders are, if you're going to do this as a professional, is very, very important. And to be up to date with these things. So this concludes 5.1, both the A version, the first one I posted, and the B version that I finished posting. The next time I present another lesson to you later on will be 5.2, which is discuss the validity and reliability of diagnosis, which goes hand in hand with 5.1. Once you decide what is abnormal, then we need to find out what is reliable as far as symptomology and that diagnosis. And you'd be surprised if you got the lesson in 5.1, how fluid it can be in 5.2. Now, one more thing before I close off on this is that let's take a look at the command term that appears on 5.1, and it is examine the concepts of normality and abnormality. This, if you haven't already noted, is a level 3 question, a hard question. Now remember, when you take your May exam, that when you go in on day 2, you're only really answering one essay, okay? And that is going to be a big essay. It's going to be a 5-paragraph essay. And this examine the concept of normality and abnormality fits that criteria. It is going to be requiring of you the ability to be able to consider an argument or concept in a way that uncovers the assumptions and interrelationship or relationships of the issue. Okay, so what you have to do is carefully scrutinize an argument or theory, concept or explanation, in this case a concept, to see how it explains something and perhaps why it explains it. An examination could also include findings, similarities, and differences. So right here in this last section with the DSM-2, comparing it to the DSM-5, for instance, is a good way to make a comparison in that argument. Okay? All right, I'm going to close out right now and post this for you, and I'll come back later on and give you 5.2.